The wind howled through the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush, carrying ice crystals that bit into exposed skin like tiny shards of glass. Lieutenant Mikhail Sokolov squinted against the assault, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him harder than his pack and rifle combined. 12 men followed him in a staggered line up the treacherous mountain path, their breath forming clouds that were immediately torn away by the relentless wind. Not much farther now, Sokolov called back over his shoulder, though he wasn't entirely sure if that was true. The military maps were accurate enough, but in this blinding whiteness, with landmarks obscured by snow, navigation became more art than science. It was January 1983, and the Soviet war in Afghanistan had ground into its fourth brutal year. Their mission was straightforward, if not simple: relieve the previous unit at Outpost Vulk and maintain surveillance of the Selong Pass for the next 3 months. The pass was a crucial supply route, and intelligence suggested increased Mujahideen activity in the region. Private Yegor Volkov, the youngest of the group at barely 19, stumbled on a hidden rock and nearly went down. Sergeant Ivan Kuznetsov, a burly man with a beard frosted white from the cold, caught him by the arm. "Watch your step, boy," Kuznetsov growled. "The mountain doesn't care if you live or die." "Yes, Sergeant," Volkov replied, his voice barely audible above the wind. Sokolov checked his compass again, then peered through the swirling snow. There a darker shadow against the white. The outpost. Relief flooded through him, though he kept his face impassive. Leaders didn't show weakness. "Outpost ahead," he announced. "Final push." The men trudged forward with renewed determination. As they drew closer, Sokolov's heart sank. The outpost was little more than a reinforced bunker with a small observation tower, surrounded by sandbags and concertina wire. Much of the structure was buried under snow drifts, giving it the appearance of a wounded animal huddling against the mountainside. "Home sweet home," muttered Corporal Dmitry Orlov, the unit's designated marksman. They approached cautiously, weapons ready, standard procedure, even though they expected to find comrades. But when they reached the entrance, they found only a coded note indicating the previous unit had already departed 2 days earlier, having received unexpected orders to support an operation further south. "So much for a proper handover," Sokolov said, pocketing the note. "Kuznetsov, Baranov, clear the interior. Orlov, Volkov, establish a perimeter. The rest of you, start digging out these entrances." The men moved with practiced efficiency despite their exhaustion. Sokolov stood watch, scanning the vast whiteness surrounding them. Something prickled at the back of his neck, that peculiar sensation of being observed. He turned slowly, eyes narrowing as he studied the ridgelines above. Nothing. Just snow and rock and sky, all bleeding together in the fading afternoon light. "Lieutenant?" It was Kuznetsov, emerging from the bunker. "Interior secure. Previous occupants left in a hurry, but the essentials are intact. Radio equipment, ammunition stores, emergency rations." "Good. Get everyone inside before dark. We'll establish watch rotations immediately." As the men filed into the bunker, Sokolov took one last look at the mountains. For a moment, just the briefest instant, he thought he saw a figure standing on a distant ridge. Then a gust of snow obscured his vision, and when it cleared, there was nothing. "Sir?" Kuznetsov was waiting by the entrance. "It's nothing," Sokolov said, though uncertainty lingered in his mind. Probably just fatigue from the climb. The interior of the bunker was cold, but offered blessed relief from the wind. The space was divided into a main room with a small, fuel-efficient stove, a communications alcove, sleeping quarters with metal bunks, and a storage area for supplies and ammunition. Everything smelled of damp concrete, unwashed bodies, and the particular metallic odor of weapons oil. "Not exactly the Kremlin Palace Hotel," Sokolov said, attempting levity as his men arranged their gear. "I've slept in worse," said Kuznetsov, who probably had. Sokolov organized the watch schedule, assigning Private Anton Baranov the first shift. Baranov was steady, reliable, not the most imaginative soldier, but that was an asset on lonely watch duty. "Keep your eyes open and your mind sharp," Sokolov instructed him. "The Mujahideen move like ghosts in this terrain." "Yes, Lieutenant," Baranov replied, checking his Alaska 74 before heading to the observation point. Night fell quickly in the mountains. an almost tangible darkness that seemed to press against the small windows of the outpost. The men ate a meager dinner of canned meat and hardtack, then sought what comfort they could find in their bunks, all except Baranov, who huddled in the observation tower, wrapped in his gray coat and a heavy blanket. The wind had died down somewhat, but the cold had intensified, seeping through layers of clothing to chill the bone. Baranov stamped his feet and flexed his fingers, fighting to stay alert. The landscape before him was a study in black and silver, moonlight reflecting off snow, creating deceptive shadows. 3 hours into his watch, as he scanned the western approach for the 100th time, something caught his eye, a silhouette standing perfectly still on a ridge, about 200 meters away. The figure appeared human-shaped but was difficult to discern clearly in the darkness. Baranov raised his binoculars, hands suddenly unsteady. He blinked, adjusting the focus. The ridge was empty. He lowered the binoculars, naked eyes searching the spot where he'd seen. What? A rock formation? A trick of light and shadow? Or something else entirely? Baranov swallowed hard, tasting fear at the back of his throat. He thought about alerting the lieutenant but hesitated. What would he say? That he'd seen a shadow that might have been nothing at all. He remained at his post, eyes fixed on that empty ridge, until Corporal Orlov came to relieve him. By then, Baranov had almost convinced himself he'd seen nothing unusual. Almost. He said nothing to Orlov about the figure, returning to the relative warmth of the bunker where he collapsed into troubled sleep, dreaming of silhouettes watching from snow-covered heights. 2 weeks into their deployment at Outpost Vulk, a routine of sorts had established itself among the 12 men. Wake at dawn, breakfast of porridge or hardtack, weapons check, patrol rotations, equipment maintenance, radio check-ins with headquarters, more patrols, evening meal, watch rotations throughout the night. Repeat. The monotony might have been bearable if not for the constant, gnawing cold and the knowledge that death could come at any moment from the surrounding mountains. The Mujahideen were masters of ambush, patient predators who might observe a Soviet position for days before striking with devastating precision. Keep your weapon clean, even if you can't do the same for yourself, Sergeant Kuznetsov instructed as the men performed their morning maintenance rituals. The veteran's face was weathered like the mountains themselves, deep lines etched by years of hardship and combat. "How many tours is this for you, Sergeant?" asked Private Volkov, who was meticulously oiling the bolt of his rifle. "Fourth," Kuznetsov replied shortly, "though this godforsaken country feels like one endless tour." "Tell us about the ambush at Jalalabad," urged Corporal Petrov, a stocky man with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow. "The new boys haven't heard it." Kuznetsov's eyes darkened, but he nodded. Sokolov, reviewing patrol maps at a small folding table, knew the sergeant's story served a purpose beyond entertainment. They kept the men alert, reminded them of the stakes. Summer of '80, Kuznetsov began, his hands continuing to work on his weapon even as he spoke. "My unit was escorting a supply convoy through a narrow valley south of Jalalabad. Perfect terrain for an ambush, but orders were orders. We had 2 BMPs and about 20 men on foot." The men listened intently, even those who'd heard the story before. There was something hypnotic about Kuznetsov's gravelly voice against the background of wind, whistling through the bunker's imperfect seals. First sign of trouble was the silence. No birds, no distant goat bells from the villages. Just wind and the sound of our own vehicles. Then, a single shot one of our point men went down. Before we could react, the valley erupted with fire from both ridgelines. Kuznetsov described the chaos that followed the desperate scramble for cover. The BEMP commander who heroically used his vehicle to shield the wounded until an RP turned the armored personnel carrier into a funeral pyre. They'd planned it perfectly, he concluded. Knew exactly where we'd be vulnerable. Of the 20 men who entered that valley, 7 walked out. Remember that when you're on patrol. The moment you think you're safe is the moment you're already dead. A somber silence followed his words, broken only when Sokolov stood and announced the day's patrol assignments. "Kuznetsov, take Baranov, Volkov, and Orlov along the eastern approach. I want eyes on that ravine we spotted yesterday. Petrov, you'll lead the western patrol with Morozov and Kovalov. The rest of you will maintain the outpost. We'll rotate assignments tomorrow. The patrols geared up quickly, checking communications equipment and ammunition. Before they departed, Sokolov pulled Kuznetsov aside. "Keep the men tight," he said quietly. "That ravine bothers me. Perfect hiding spot for an ambush." Kuznetsov nodded. "We'll approach from the high ground, keep our silhouettes off the ridgeline." "Good hunting," Sokolov said, clasping the sergeant's shoulder briefly. The Eastern Patrol moved out, disappearing into the swirling snow within minutes. Sokolov returned to the communications alcove, where Private Leonid Zaitsev, their radio operator, was attempting to establish the morning check-in with headquarters. "Still getting interference, sir," Zaitsev reported, adjusting dials with a frustrated expression. "Weather's playing havoc with the signal." "Keep trying," Sokolov ordered. "We need that resupply confirmation." Their ammunition and medical supplies were adequate for now, but a prolonged engagement would deplete their resources quickly. The promised resupply was already 3 days late, delayed by the same blizzard conditions that had made their first 2 weeks at the outpost so miserable. Hours passed. The Western Patrol returned first, reporting nothing unusual beyond some tracks that might have been wildlife or humans impossible to tell in the partially drifted snow. Sokolov was beginning to worry about Kuznetsov's group when they finally radioed their approach. The sergeant's expression was grim as he led his men into the bunker, stomping snow from their boots. "Found something?" he said without preamble, placing an object on the table. It was a crude pressure plate, the kind used to trigger improvised explosives. This one had been partially assembled but abandoned, perhaps when the builder was interrupted or decided to relocate. "Where?" Sokolov asked, examining the device. "About a kilometer east of the ravine, hidden under an overhanging rock. Recent snow hadn't fully covered it." Kuznetsov pulled off his gloves, flexing fingers stiff with cold. There were tracks leading away, heading north. At least 2 men, maybe more. We followed until they disappeared on the rocky ground. Sokolov nodded slowly. "They're probing our patrol routes, looking for patterns." "That's my assessment," Kuznetsov agreed. "We varied our return path as a precaution." "Good work." Sokolov turned to Zaitsev. "Any luck with headquarters?" "Finally got through, sir. Resupply mission is scheduled for tomorrow morning, weather permitting." "Weather permitting," echoed Sokolov with a hint of bitterness. In these mountains, that phrase was almost meaningless. The weather permitted what it wished when it wished, with complete indifference to human plans or needs. That night, the temperature plummeted further. The men huddled near the small stove in the main room, playing cards or writing letters that might never reach their destinations. Sokolov reviewed his patrol logs, looking for patterns they themselves might be inadvertently establishing. Private Baranov, off duty and supposedly resting, approached the lieutenant's table with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Sir, may I speak with you privately?" Something in the young soldier's tone made Sokolov set aside his work. "Of course." They moved to the relative privacy of the storage area, where Baranov spoke in a low, uncertain voice. "Sir, I saw something last night, during my watch." "Mujahideen?" Sokolov asked sharply. "No, sir. At least I don't think so." Baranov swallowed visibly. "It was a soldier. One of ours." Sokolov frowned. "Explain." "He was just standing there in the snow, about 50 meters beyond our perimeter. A Soviet soldier in uniform. I called out, but he didn't respond. When I raised my rifle to sight him better, he was gone." "Gone how?" "Just gone, sir. I went out to check. I know I shouldn't have left my post, but I thought maybe he was injured. A survivor from another unit, perhaps. There were no footprints, Lieutenant. Nothing but undisturbed snow." Sokolov studied Baranov's face. The young man was clearly disturbed, but he didn't appear to be lying. Still, the explanation was obvious. "You fell asleep on watch," Sokolov said, not unkindly. "It happens in these conditions. The cold, the isolation, the exhaustion, they play tricks on the mind." "No, sir, I wasn't asleep," Baranov insisted. "I know what I saw." "What you think you saw," Sokolov corrected. "Listen to me, Anton. We're all under immense strain here. The mind seeks patterns, creates explanations for the unexplainable. A shadow becomes a man. Wind sounds like voices. It's normal. Baranov looked unconvinced but nodded reluctantly. Yes, sir. I understand. Get some rest, Sokolov advised. And next time you think you see something, use the radio before investigating. That's what it's for. Yes, sir. As Baranov returned to his bunk, Sokolov remained in the storage area, troubled. The young private was one of his most reliable men, not given to fantasies or exaggerations. If he said he saw something, Sokolov shook his head, dismissing the thought. Baranov had dozed off, had a vivid dream, perhaps even a hallucination brought on by the thin mountain air and extreme cold. There were no other Soviet units for 30 kilometers in any direction. The alternative that some solitary Russian soldier was wandering the mountains alone was impossible. And yet, as he returned to his patrol logs, Sokolov couldn't quite shake the memory of his own first day at the outpost when he'd glimpsed what might have been a figure watching from the ridge. He'd dismissed it then as fatigue. Now, he wasn't so certain. The next morning brought no relief from the cold, but the sky had cleared somewhat, offering better visibility than they'd had in days. Sokolov found himself watching Baranov during breakfast, noting the dark circles under the young man's eyes and his distracted manner. Clearly, whatever he thought he'd seen had disturbed him deeply. Baranov, Sokolov called, making a sudden decision. You'll remain at the outpost today. Help Zaitsev monitor communications for the resupply mission. Sir? Baranov looked surprised. I'm fit for patrol duty. That's an order, Private, Sokolov said firmly. We need sharp eyes on the radio today. The real reason, which Sokolov kept to himself, was that he wanted Baranov to rest. A soldier functioning on minimal sleep was a danger to himself and others, especially in combat conditions. At mid-morning, they received a transmission from headquarters that changed their plans for the day. Increased Mujahideen activity reported throughout the sector, Zaitsev relayed, looking up from his radio. Multiple Soviet patrols have encountered resistance. They're delaying all non-essential movements, including our resupply. A murmur of discontent rippled through the bunker. They were already rationing ammunition, and medical supplies, particularly antibiotics and painkillers, were running dangerously low. How long? Sokolov asked. Indefinite, sir. They'll reassess in 48 hours. Sokolov nodded grimly. Kuznetsov will need to adjust our patrol patterns, minimize ammunition expenditure while maintaining surveillance. Orlov, inventory all medical supplies again. I want to know exactly what we have. The day progressed with a heightened sense of tension. The patrols reported nothing unusual, but every man felt the increased vulnerability of their position. That evening, as darkness fell and the temperature dropped even further, Sokolov assigned Corporal Dmitry Orlov to the first watch. Orlov was their best marksman, with keen eyes and a steady temperament. If anyone could be trusted to maintain vigilance in these conditions, it was him. The night deepened. Most of the men had retreated to their bunks, seeking warmth under thin blankets. Sokolov remained awake, updating his logbook by the light of a small kerosene lamp, when his radio crackled. Lieutenant. Orlov's voice was unnaturally tight. I need you at the observation point. Now. Sokolov was on his feet instantly, grabbing his sidearm and coat. He made his way quickly to the small tower where Orlov maintained his vigil. Report, he said as he climbed the ladder. Orlov turned, his face pale in the moonlight. Sir, there's someone out there. Sokolov moved to the observation slit, following Orlov's pointing finger. At first, he saw nothing but the familiar landscape of snow and rock. Then, at the edge of visibility, a figure materialized from the swirling snow. A Soviet soldier, standing perfectly still despite the howling wind. What the hell? Sokolov whispered, reaching for his binoculars. It appeared about 5 minutes ago, Orlov said, his voice steady despite the clear fear in his eyes. Just standing there, not moving. Through the binoculars, Sokolov could make out more details. The figure wore a standard-issue Soviet gray coat and Ushanka hat, but something was wrong with the uniform. It appeared tattered with dark stains visible even at this distance. The soldier's stance was unnatural, too still, too rigid. Have you tried hailing him? Sokolov asked, lowering the binoculars. Yes, sir. No response. Sokolov raised his voice against the wind. You there? Identify yourself. The figure remained motionless for several heartbeats. Then, with terrible slowness, it began to turn. Both men watched, transfixed, as the figure rotated to face them directly. Through his binoculars, Sokolov caught a glimpse of the soldier's face, blue with cold, eyes like dark pits in a mask of frost. Then, between one blink and the next, the figure vanished. Did you see that? Orlov's voice had lost its professional calm. Did you see its face? Sokolov lowered his binoculars, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature seeping into his bones. I saw something, he admitted. Wait here. Ignoring Orlov's protest, Sokolov descended from the observation tower and made his way to the perimeter fence. With his sidearm drawn, he pushed through the gate and advanced cautiously to the spot where the figure had stood. Nothing. No footprints, no disturbance in the snow. Just an empty, windswept expanse. He returned to find Orlov still at his post, face ashen. Nothing out there, Sokolov reported. No tracks, no signs of movement. That's impossible, Orlov insisted. We both saw it. Him, whatever it was. Sokolov had no explanation to offer. The rational part of his mind searched for logical possibilities of play of light and shadow, a shared hallucination brought on by stress and altitude, perhaps even an elaborate mujahideen trick designed to unnerve them. None seemed adequate to explain what they had witnessed. Log it, he finally said. Possible unidentified movement at the perimeter. No contact established, no evidence found upon investigation. Sir, Orlov began, clearly wanting to say more. That's all, Corporal, Sokolov cut him off. Maintain your watch. Report any further sightings immediately. As he descended from the tower, Sokolov's mind turned to Baranov's story from the previous night. Not a dream or hallucination then, or at least not Baranov's alone. Something was happening at Outpost Vulk, something Sokolov couldn't explain with his training or experience. For the first time since their arrival, Lieutenant Mikhail Sokolov felt truly afraid not of the Mujahideen or the brutal environment, but of whatever phantom soldier patrolled the perimeter of their isolated outpost, leaving no tracks in the endless snow. By morning, the story had spread through the unit like wildfire. Sokolov had intended to keep the incident between himself and Orlov, but the marksman had confided in Kuznetsov, who in turn had mentioned it to others. Now, over a breakfast of cold porridge and stale bread, the men spoke of little else. It's the altitude, suggested Private Morozov, a broad-shouldered man with a university education he rarely mentioned. Oxygen deprivation can cause visual hallucinations. That doesn't explain how both the lieutenant and Orlov saw the same thing, countered Corporal Petrov, or Baranov the night before. Mass hysteria, then, Morozov persisted. One person suggests an image, others begin to see it too. It's documented in psychological literature. Bullshit, Kuznetsov growled. I've been in these mountains 4 tours, never hallucinated anything. Maybe you're not imaginative enough, Sergeant Morozov replied with a thin smile. Enough, Sokolov interrupted. Whatever it was, stress, tricks of light, or something else, it doesn't change our mission. We maintain the outpost, we patrol our sector, we stay alert for actual threats. The men fell silent, but Sokolov could see the unease in their faces. Fear was contagious in small, isolated units like theirs. Left unchecked, it could destroy their effectiveness as quickly as any enemy action. Kuznetsov, he said, changing the subject, take the Eastern Patrol today. I want a thorough sweep of that ravine again. The Mujahideen might be using it as a staging area. As the patrol assignments were distributed and the men prepared for their duties, Private Zaitsev approached Sokolov with a troubled expression. Sir, there's something you should know about the radio. Problems with transmission again? Sokolov asked. No, sir. Well, yes, but it's more than that. Zaitsev hesitated. Last night, during my shift monitoring communications, I picked up some strange interference. At first, I thought it was just atmospheric disturbance, but then I could swear I heard words. Russian words buried in the static. Sokolov frowned. Could have been cross-talk from another Soviet unit. That's what I thought, sir. But I checked all the assigned frequencies. There was nothing scheduled, and the transmission, if that's what it was, didn't follow any standard protocol. Just fragments, words cutting in and out. Could you make out what was said? Zaitsev looked uncomfortable. Most of it was unintelligible, but I distinctly heard cold and waiting several times, and something that sounded like coming back. A chill ran down Sokolov's spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Log it, he ordered. Monitor all frequencies carefully. If you hear it again, record as much as you can. Yes, sir. As Zaitsev returned to his post, Sergeant Kuznetsov approached, his weathered face unusually solemn. A word, Lieutenant. They moved to a corner of the bunker, away from the others. Kuznetsov spoke in a low voice. The men are talking. About the figure. There's a story that might be relevant. Go on, Sokolov prompted, curious despite his skepticism. During the initial push through the Salang Pass in '79, before my time here, a squad from the 40th Army went missing during a blizzard. 8 men. Search parties found nothing, no bodies, no equipment. They were just gone. Military operations lose men all the time, especially in terrain like this, Sokolov pointed out. True, but there were rumors. The search parties reported strange things, voices in the storm, figures glimpsed at the edge of visibility. Some said the missing men had deserted, others that they'd been captured by the Mujahideen, but a few believed something else took them, something that belonged to these mountains. Sokolov studied the sergeant's face. Kuznetsov was not a man given to superstition or flights of fancy. That he would even repeat such a story indicated how seriously he took the recent sightings. You think our phantom soldier is connected to this missing squad? Kuznetsov shrugged. I think these mountains are old, Lieutenant. Older than Russia, older than Afghanistan. People have been fighting and dying here since before recorded history. Maybe something of that remains. It was the closest to philosophy Sokolov had ever heard from the hardened sergeant. Before he could respond, a commotion erupted from the communications alcove. Lieutenant. Zaitsev called urgently. Message from headquarters. Sokolov moved quickly to the radio, Kuznetsov following. Zaitsev handed him the handset. This is Outpost Vulk, Lieutenant Sokolov commanding, he said. Through heavy static, a voice replied, Vulk, this is command. Be advised, weather conditions deteriorating rapidly throughout your sector. Meteorology predicts severe blizzard within 6 hours. All patrols are to return to base immediately. Repeat, all patrols return to base. Hunker down until further notice. Understood, command. What about our resupply? Negative on resupply. All air operations suspended indefinitely. You're on your own until conditions improve. Command out. The radio fell silent. Sokolov turned to find most of his men had gathered, having overheard the transmission. You heard it, he said grimly. Recall all patrols immediately. We need to secure the outpost before the storm hits. As the men scrambled to execute his orders, Sokolov moved to the observation slit, gazing out at the mountains. The sky was still relatively clear in their immediate vicinity, but to the west, dark clouds were building, an ominous wall advancing toward them. Soon they would be completely cut off, 12 men in a concrete box, buried in snow, with dwindling supplies and something unexplainable stalking their perimeter. And somewhere out in those vast, indifferent mountains, the Mujahideen waited, as patient as the storm itself. That night, the blizzard struck with a fury that seemed almost personal. Wind screamed through every crack in the bunker's structure, driving snow and ice before it. The temperature inside the outpost plummeted despite their best efforts to seal drafts and conserve heat from the small stove. The men huddled in the main room, wrapped in every layer of clothing they possessed, playing cards to distract themselves from the howling tempest outside. Only the duty watch remained at the observation post, rotating hourly because no one could endure the cold there for longer. It was during one such rotation, shortly after midnight, that it happened again. Private Volkov was the first to notice, his young face suddenly draining of color as he stared through the observation slit. Without a word, he gestured frantically to Private Kovalov and Corporal Petrov, who were nearest. There, standing in the driving snow just beyond their perimeter fence, was the figure. Unlike previous sightings, where it had appeared at the edge of visibility, this time the phantom soldier stood barely 20 meters from the bunker, Despite the hurricane-force winds that threatened to tear the observation tower from its moorings, the figure remained perfectly still, greatcoat and Ushanka untouched by the storm. "Get the lieutenant," Kovalov whispered urgently. Petrov was already moving, sliding down the ladder to the main room where Sokolov was reviewing patrol reports. "Sir," Petrov said, his voice tight with tension, "it's back. All three of us can see it." Sokolov was on his feet instantly, following Petrov to the observation post. By the time they arrived, Volkov and Kovalov were transfixed, neither willing to look away from the apparition. "It hasn't moved," Volkov reported, his breath frosting in the bitter cold of the tower. "Not an inch, just standing there, watching." Sokolov pushed forward to see for himself. The figure was exactly as described, a Soviet soldier in tattered winter gear, standing impossibly still in the midst of the raging blizzard. Through his binoculars, Sokolov could make out more details than before. The soldier's uniform was from an earlier period of the war, the initial invasion, perhaps. The greatcoat was torn at the shoulder, revealing what might have been a lieutenant's insignia. For nearly a full minute, they watched in silence. Then, as if sensing their combined scrutiny, the figure slowly raised an arm, pointing directly at the outpost. "Christ," breathed Kovalov. "What does it want?" Before anyone could answer, the figure lowered its arm and began to dissolve, not walking away or disappearing suddenly, but literally coming apart, like snow returning to snow, until nothing remained but the empty, howling night. The four men stood frozen, unable to process what they had collectively witnessed. Finally, Sokolov broke the silence. "Back to your posts," he ordered, his voice remarkably steady. "Log the sighting. Full details." "Sir," Volkov began, his young face contorted with fear. "What?" "That's an order, Private," Sokolov cut him off. "We are still soldiers of the Soviet Union, regardless of what may or may not be out there." The men complied, though Sokolov could see the fear had taken root deeply. He descended to the main room where Kuznetsov waited, having heard enough to understand what had occurred. "Three of them saw it this time," Sokolov said quietly. "Plus me. That makes 6 of us who've witnessed. Whatever it is." Kuznetsov's expression was grim. "The men are scared, Lieutenant. Not of the Mujahideen or the cold, but of this thing. They're beginning to talk about curses, angry spirits. Morozov's rational explanations aren't convincing anyone anymore." "What do you think it is?" Sokolov asked, genuinely curious about the veteran's opinion. Kuznetsov considered for a moment. "I think something terrible happened here. Something that left a mark." He paused. "Or a warning." The blizzard continued through the night and into the following day, confining the unit to the outpost. By mid-morning, the storm had abated enough that Sokolov felt it safe to send out a limited patrol not far, just enough to assess conditions and check the immediate surroundings. "Kuznetsov, take Orlov and Baranov. Stay within visual range of the outpost. I want you back in 30 minutes, regardless of what you find." The 3 men geared up, checking weapons and communications equipment. Before they departed, Sokolov pulled Kuznetsov aside. "If you see anything at all that seems unusual, return immediately. No heroics." Kuznetsov nodded grimly. "Understood, sir." The patrol pushed out into the snow-laden landscape. Visibility was poor, but improving as the storm moved eastward. Sokolov watched from the observation tower, following their progress through binoculars. They moved methodically, checking the perimeter fence for damage before expanding outward in a standard search pattern. Everything appeared normal until they reached the northern edge of their patrol route. There, Kuznetsov suddenly stopped, signaling the others to halt. Through his binoculars, Sokolov saw the sergeant point to something partially buried in the snow. For a tense minute, the 3 men examined whatever they had found. Then Kuznetsov spoke into his radio. "Lieutenant, we found something. Tracks leading north. They look recent, made since the worst of the storm passed." "Human?" Sokolov asked. "Affirmative. Mujahideen, most likely. They're heading toward that series of caves we mapped last week." Sokolov considered his options. The caves were about 1 kilometer away, too far for his comfort given the weather conditions and their limited manpower. but too close to ignore if enemy fighters were using them as a staging area. Follow the tracks, but maintain extreme caution, he ordered. First sign of contact, fall back immediately. Understood, Kuznetsov replied, continuing north. Sokolov watched as the three men proceeded carefully along the line of footprints, weapons ready. They soon disappeared behind a rocky outcropping, forcing him to rely on radio contact. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Sokolov was about to recall them when Kuznetsov's voice crackled through the radio. Lieutenant, we've reached the caves. No sign of active Mujahideen presence, but there was a long pause. Sir, we found something you need to see. What is it, Sergeant? Bodies, sir. Soviet soldiers. Frozen. They appear to have been here for years. Sokolov felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Secure the area. I'm coming to you. Send coordinates. After instructing Corporal Petrov to command the outpost in his absence, Sokolov gathered 4 more men, Volkov, Morozov, Kovalov, and Zaitsev, and headed out to the caves. The journey was difficult, with snow drifts reaching waist height in places, but they made steady progress following the trail broken by the first patrol. They found Kuznetsov, Orlov, and Baranov at the mouth of a cave set into the mountainside, partially concealed by an overhanging ridge. The sergeant's expression was grave as he saluted. In here, sir, he said, leading the way into the cave. The interior was surprisingly spacious, with a high ceiling that disappeared into darkness. What little daylight penetrated illuminated a scene that made Sokolov's blood run cold. 5 bodies lay arranged in a rough semicircle near the back of the cave. They were perfectly preserved by the extreme cold, frozen in postures suggesting they had died huddled together for warmth. Their uniforms identified them as Soviet soldiers from the initial Afghan campaign, circa 1979, exactly the period Kuznetsov had mentioned in his story about the missing squad. There were supposed to be 8 of them, Sokolov said softly, recalling the sergeant's tale. Yes, sir, Kuznetsov confirmed. 3 are missing. Sokolov moved closer, examining the bodies. Despite years in the cave, their features were still recognizable, faces contorted in the final agonies of freezing to death. Their uniforms were tattered but largely intact, with one notable exception. This one has no coat, Sokolov observed, pointing to a corporal whose upper body was clad only in a standard field uniform, entirely inadequate for the mountain conditions. I noticed that too, sir, Orlov said. Looks like he gave it to someone else, or someone took it after he died. No, Sokolov said slowly, a terrible suspicion forming in his mind. Look at how they're arranged. These men didn't just die randomly. Someone positioned them after death. It was true. The bodies had been placed with a certain care, arms crossed over chests, legs straightened. It was the arrangement of a makeshift burial, not the chaotic sprawl of men who had frozen to death in the dark. Someone survived, Baranov whispered. Someone buried their comrades. Before anyone could respond, a sound echoed from deeper in the cave, a scraping, like boots on stone. All 8 men raised their weapons instantly, training them on the darkness beyond the bodies. Who's there? Sokolov called out. Identify yourself. Silence answered him. Then another sound, a metallic click that every soldier recognized, the safety of an Alaska being disengaged. Down. Sokolov shouted, just as gunfire erupted from the darkness. The wind howled like a wounded animal as Private Yuri Nestorov pressed himself against the cold stone of the cave wall, his breath forming small clouds that dissipated into the darkness. Outside, the voices of Mujahideen fighters carried on the bitter mountain air. Close, too close. Lieutenant Sokolov held up a closed fist, signaling complete silence to his remaining men. They had been pinned down for nearly 6 hours now, having barely escaped the ambush at the cave with the frozen bodies. 2 men wounded, supplies dwindling, and now a Mujahideen patrol had established a camp barely 50 meters from their only exit. How many? Sokolov whispered to Kuznetsov, who had just returned from scouting the narrow opening. At least 15, the sergeant replied, his voice barely audible. Setting up for the night. They have the high ground and every approach covered. Sokolov nodded grimly. And the radio? Zaitsev shook his head. Still nothing, sir. The mountains are blocking transmission completely. The lieutenant surveyed his men. After the firefight in the cave with the bodies, they had retreated deeper into the mountain, discovering a network of tunnels that had provided temporary sanctuary. But the Mujahideen had tracked them, forcing them to hole up in this dead-end cavern with a single exit that now lay under enemy observation. Private Nesterov, barely 20, the youngest of their group, shivered uncontrollably despite being wrapped in Orlov's spare coat. His lips had taken on a bluish tinge that Sokolov recognized all too well as the early signs of hypothermia. Baranov, Sokolov motioned, "Check our ammunition." The private did a quick inventory. 30 rounds per man, sir. 2 grenades left. Not enough for a prolonged engagement, especially against superior numbers in well-defended positions. The temperature was dropping rapidly as night fell, and without the ability to build a fire, they faced a grim reality. The cold might kill them before the Mujahideen had the chance. "We need to conserve body heat," Kuznetsov announced, seeing Nesterov's condition deteriorating. "Everyone huddle together. Share blankets." The men complied without complaint, setting aside usual military formality. They arranged themselves in a tight circle, backs toward each other, sharing what meager warmth their bodies could generate. Orlov and Morozov flanked Nesterov, trying to transfer their body heat to the young private, whose shivering had become alarmingly violent. "Stay with us, kid," Orlov murmured, rubbing Nesterov's arms vigorously. "Think about Moscow in summer. Remember that girl you told me about? The one from the bakery?" Nesterov nodded weakly, his eyes struggling to focus. "Natasha," he whispered through chattering teeth. "That's right. Natasha with the green eyes. You're going to see her again." Sokolov watched the exchange with growing concern. Without proper shelter or heat, Nesterov wouldn't last the night. None of them might. The hours crept by with excruciating slowness. Outside, the wind's howl diminished, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by occasional voices from the Mujahideen camp. The temperature continued to drop, their breath now forming ice crystals on their beards and eyebrows. Nesterov had stopped shivering, a dangerous sign. His breathing was shallow, his responses increasingly incoherent when the others tried to engage him. "Lieutenant," Kuznetsov said softly, moving to Sokolov's side. "The boy won't make it till morning, and the others aren't far behind." Sokolov nodded, the weight of command pressing down on him like a physical burden. "We can't stay here, and we can't go back. That leaves only one option." "A breakout?" Kuznetsov looked skeptical. "Against those odds in our condition? Not immediately. We wait until just before dawn, when they'll be at their most vulnerable. Use the grenades to create confusion, then push through to the eastern slope. If we can make it to the ridgeline, we have a chance of reaching our outpost." The sergeant considered this, then nodded slowly. "It's better than freezing to death in this hole." As they discussed the specifics of their desperate plan, a strange sensation crept over the cave, a subtle shift in the air pressure, accompanied by a drop in temperature so sudden that every man felt it like a physical blow. "What the hell?" Baranov whispered, his breath now billowing in thick clouds. Sokolov turned, hand instinctively moving to his weapon, and froze. There, standing among them in the center of their huddled circle, was the ghostly soldier. No one moved. No one spoke. The apparition was more solid than in previous sightings, its features clearly visible in the dim light. A lieutenant's insignia gleamed dully on the tattered uniform. The face, though blue with cold, was that of a young man, perhaps Nesterov's age, with high Slavic cheekbones and deep-set eyes that reflected no light. For several heartbeats, the phantom stood motionless, regarding them with an expression that might have been sorrow or urgency. It was impossible to tell. Then, with deliberate slowness, it turned and moved toward the back of the cave, where solid rock formed a dead end. Instead of stopping, the figure continued forward, passing through the stone as if it were mist. "Did you see?" Vulk began, but Sokolov cut him off with a sharp gesture. "It's showing us something," he said, rising to his feet despite the protest of cramped muscles. "There must be a passage." Kuznetsov was already moving, reaching the rock wall and running his hands over its surface. "Nothing," he reported. "Solid stone." But Sokolov wasn't convinced. He joined the sergeant, examining the wall carefully. It looked impenetrable, but when he pressed his ear against it and tapped, a different sound returned than from the surrounding rock. "Here," he said, focusing on a section slightly darker than the rest. "This could be thinner." The men gathered around, suddenly energized despite their exhaustion. Baranov produced a small entrenching tool, and they began to probe the wall methodically. After several minutes, Orlov found a narrow crack almost invisible to the naked eye. "Lieutenant," he called softly, "there's a draft coming through here." Sokolov felt it, the faintest movement of air against his fingertips. "Widen it," he ordered. They worked in shifts, carefully chipping away at the crack, expanding it centimeter by centimeter. The rock was brittle, fracturing along natural seams that had been disguised by years of mineral deposits. After an hour of painstaking effort, they had created an opening large enough for a man to squeeze through. "Orlov," Sokolov directed, "you're the smallest. See what's on the other side." The corporal nodded, removing his pack and weapon, which were handed to Baranov. He positioned himself at the opening, then wriggled forward, disappearing up to his waist. "There's a passage," came his muffled voice. "Narrow but passable. Slopes downward." "Can you see where it leads?" Sokolov asked. "No, sir. Too dark, but the air feels fresher." That was enough for Sokolov. "Come back through. We're all going." They widened the opening a bit more, then began the difficult process of moving their equipment and wounded through the narrow gap. Nesterov, now barely conscious, had to be pushed from behind and pulled from the front, his limp form barely fitting through the opening. Once on the other side, they found themselves in a natural tunnel, roughly circular and just tall enough for a man to stand upright. As Orlov had reported, it sloped gently downward, curving away into darkness. "Form a line," Sokolov ordered. "Keep physical contact with the person ahead of you. Kuznetsov, take point. I'll bring up the rear." They moved slowly, feeling their way along the rough stone walls. The air grew noticeably warmer as they descended, a blessed relief after the bone-chilling cold of the upper cave. The tunnel twisted and turned, occasionally branching, but Kuznetsov maintained their course by following the strongest air current, a woodsman's trick he'd learned in his native Siberia. After what seemed like hours but was probably less than one, a faint grayish light appeared ahead. The men quickened their pace, hope providing fresh energy. The tunnel widened into a small chamber, at the far end of which a narrow fissure admitted the pale light of dawn. Kuznetsov approached cautiously, peering through the opening. "We're on the eastern face," he reported with barely contained excitement. "At least a kilometer from where we entered. No sign of the Mujahideen." A collective sigh of relief passed through the group. Sokolov moved forward to confirm Kuznetsov's assessment. The fissure opened onto a steep, snow-covered slope that descended toward a valley. He recognized they were indeed on the opposite side of the mountain from the Mujahideen camp. "We can make it back to the outpost from here," he said. "It's a difficult descent, but manageable." As the men prepared to exit the tunnel, gathering their equipment and checking weapons, Sokolov felt a now familiar change in the air. He turned slowly, already knowing what he would see. The ghostly soldier stood at the entrance to the tunnel they had just traversed. For the first time, it seemed to acknowledge Sokolov directly, meeting his gaze with those empty, haunted eyes. Then it raised an arm, pointing not toward the fissure that led to safety, but to their right, where another, less obvious passage branched off from the chamber. "Sir?" Kuznetsov had noticed Sokolov's fixed stare. "He wants us to go that way," Sokolov said quietly. The sergeant followed his gaze but clearly saw nothing. "The ghost again." Sokolov nodded. The apparition remained in place, arm extended, its expression one of unmistakable urgency. "We should go," Baranov urged, supporting the semi-conscious Nesterov. "The boy needs medical attention." Sokolov hesitated, torn between the clear path to safety and the mysterious summons of their spectral guide. The ghost had led them this far, saving them from certain death. Why would it now direct them away from salvation? "Sergeant, take the men through the fissure," he decided. "Start down the slope. I'm going to check where this other passage leads." "With respect, sir, that's not wise," Kuznetsov protested. "We should stay together." "That's an order, Sergeant. 5 minutes. If I'm not back by then, continue to the outpost without me." Kuznetsov clearly wanted to argue but nodded stiffly. 5 minutes, sir. As the men began to file through the narrow exit, Sokolov approached the side passage. The ghost had vanished again, but he felt drawn forward by something he couldn't explain, a certainty that there was something important he needed to see. The passage was narrower than the main tunnel, but still navigable. He followed it for perhaps 30 meters before it opened into another, smaller chamber, and there he found what the ghost had wanted him to discover. A shelter of sorts had been constructed against one wall, a crude arrangement of stones and what might once have been branches, now long since rotted away. Within this makeshift refuge lay the remains of 3 men, their uniforms marking them as Soviet soldiers. Unlike the bodies in the upper cave, these had not been carefully arranged in death. They lay where they had fallen, one clutching what appeared to be a journal, the pages now fused together by time and the elements. Sokolov approached reverently, understanding flooding through him. These were the missing members of the squad Kuznetsov had mentioned, the ones not found with the other 5 bodies. They had survived longer, making their way through the mountain via the same passage that had just saved Sokolov and his men. He gently removed the journal from the desiccated fingers of what had once been a Soviet officer or lieutenant, judging by the tattered insignia still visible on the uniform. Though damaged, some pages might still be legible. This could be the answer to what had happened to the lost patrol, to why their ghosts still haunted these mountains. A call echoed down the passage, Kuznetsov warning that his 5 minutes were nearly up. Sokolov carefully stowed the journal in his coat, then, with a final glance at the remains of his predecessors, made his way back to join his men. As he emerged from the side passage, he saw that most of his squad had already exited through the fissure. Only Kuznetsov remained, his expression a mixture of relief and curiosity. "Find anything, sir?" "The rest of the missing patrol," Sokolov replied simply. "And perhaps some answers." They squeezed through the fissure into the bright morning light, the cold air sharp in their lungs after the relative warmth of the tunnels. Below, the rest of the squad had already begun making their way down the slope, supporting Nestorov between them. And there, at the bottom of the slope, stood the ghostly soldier. This time all the men saw him, Sokolov could tell by the way they halted their descent, forming a frozen tableau against the snow. The apparition raised its arm once more, pointing to the east, where a faint trail could be discerned winding through the rocks. "He's showing us the way home," Sokolov said quietly. Kuznetsov nodded, no longer doubting what he couldn't see. "Then we'd best follow." The descent was treacherous but manageable, with each man helping the others navigate the steepest sections. Nestorov, revived somewhat by the fresh air and movement, was able to assist in his own transport, though he remained dangerously weak. At the bottom, they paused to reorient themselves. The ghost had vanished again, but the path that it indicated was clear, a narrow track that skirted the base of the mountain, leading eastward toward what appeared to be a sheltered valley. "That's not the way back to the outpost," Orlov observed. "No," Sokolov agreed, "but I think we're meant to follow it anyway." They moved as quickly as Nestorov's condition would allow, alert for any sign of enemy movement. The path wound through a series of rocky outcroppings before descending into a small, protected valley nestled between 2 ridge lines. And there, partially hidden by a stand of stunted pines, they found the shepherd's hut. It was a simple structure of stone and timber, weathered by years of harsh mountain conditions but still intact. A crude corral stood empty beside it. Whoever had used this place was long gone. "Approach with caution," Sokolov ordered, though he sensed no danger here. Kuznetsov and Orlov advanced toward the hut, weapons ready. After a brief inspection, Kuznetsov signaled the all clear, and the rest of the squad moved forward. The interior of the hut was Spartan but offered blessed shelter from the elements. A stone hearth dominated one wall, with a stack of old, dry wood beside it. A rough wooden platform that might have served as a bed occupied another corner. But what drew their immediate attention was the metal footlocker positioned conspicuously in the center of the single room. Soviet military issue, its green paint faded and chipped, but the red star still visible on the lid. "This is no shepherd's hut," Baranov whispered. "It's a waypoint." Sokolov approached the footlocker cautiously. It wasn't locked, the hasp hanging open as if inviting inspection. He lifted the lid, revealing a cache of supplies that seemed almost miraculous in their current circumstances. Medical kits with antibiotics and morphine and rations, ammunition, even a small bottle of vodka. "These are our supplies," Kuznetsov said in amazement, examining a ration pack. "Soviet Army issue, current stock." "How is that possible?" Volkov asked. "Who would leave this here?" Sokolov had no answer, but he wasn't about to question their good fortune. "Treat Nestorov," he ordered, gesturing to the medical supplies. "The rest of you secure the perimeter and get a fire started. We'll rest here until nightfall, then continue to the outpost." As his men set about their task with renewed energy, Sokolov moved to a corner of the hut, where a shaft of light penetrated through a small window. He removed the journal from his coat, carefully separating pages that had stuck together over the years. Most were illegible, the ink faded or smeared beyond recognition. But a few entries remained clear enough to read the final testament of a doomed lieutenant trying to keep his men alive in these merciless mountains. December 18th, 1979. Separated from the main unit during the blizzard. Visibility 0. Compass useless due to magnetic anomalies in these mountains. Found shelter in a cave system with the remaining men. Petrov, Azarov, and Ivanov already showing signs of severe frostbite. December 20th, 1979. Petrov died during the night. The others are failing rapidly. No sign of rescue parties. The cold is absolute. We burn what little wood we can find, but it's not enough. Decided to try moving deeper into the cave, seeking better shelter or perhaps another exit. December 21st, 1979. Found 5 of our comrades who had separated from us earlier, all dead, frozen. We arranged them properly, best we could. Komarov insisted on leaving his coat with them, some kind of symbolic gesture. Couldn't talk him out of it. His mind is going like the rest of us. The next several pages were illegible, damaged by time or the elements. Sokolov carefully turned to what appeared to be the final entry, dated December 27th, 1979. The tunnels led us to this side of the mountain. Azarov spotted this hut. A miracle. But too late for Ivanov, who died just as we reached it. Komarov followed hours later. It's just me now. Ow. I found supplies here, rations, medicine, ammunition. As if someone knew we would come. But too late for my men. All gone now. The cold takes everything in the end. I hear the wind calling their names. Sometimes I think I see them standing in the snow watching me, waiting for me to join them. I will not leave this place. My strength is gone. But I make this vow: we will guide those who come after. We will not let them be taken by the cold or the enemy. This I swear on the memory of my men. Lieutenant Pavel Morozov, 40th Army, 181st Motor Rifle Regiment. The final words were scrawled shakily, the handwriting deteriorating as the dying officer's strength failed him. Sokolov closed the journal gently, a profound sadness washing over him. Lieutenant Morozov had died here, alone, the last of his squad, but somehow he had kept his vow. "Sir," it was Kuznetsov, approaching with a steaming cup. "Found some tea in the supplies. Thought you could use it." Sokolov accepted the cup gratefully. "Thank you, Sergeant." Kuznetsov nodded toward the journal. "Anything useful?" "More than useful," Sokolov replied. "It's their story. The Lost Patrol. Their lieutenant's name was Morozov." A shadow passed over Kuznetsov's weathered face. "Pavel Morozov?" Sokolov glanced up sharply. "You knew him." The sergeant sank onto a rough wooden stool, suddenly looking every one of his 40-plus years. "We were in the same unit before Afghanistan. He was a good man. A good officer." He paused, seeming to struggle with something. "I was supposed to be on that patrol." "What?" "The patrol that disappeared. I was assigned to it originally. But at the last minute, I was reassigned to escort a supply convoy. Morozov took my place as second in command." Kuznetsov's eyes were distant, seeing something far beyond the walls of the shepherd's hut. "When they didn't return, I volunteered for every search party. We never found a trace. Until now," Sokolov said quietly. Kuznetsov nodded, his face a mask of old grief. I've carried that with me all these years. The question of what happened to them. The guilt of not being there. It wasn't your fault. I know that. Logically. But still. He gestured vaguely. And now this. The ghost. Morozov's ghost leading us to safety. To this place. Sokolov considered this. Perhaps that's why you're seeing him now. Because you were meant to be with them then. Perhaps Kuznetsov agreed. Or perhaps he's fulfilling his vow. The last lines in his journal, what did they say? Sokolov reopened the journal to the final page. We will guide those who come after. We will not let them be taken by the cold or the enemy. This I swear on the memory of my men. The two officers sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the weight of those words. Around them, the hut had transformed. A fire now burned in the hearth, casting warm light across the stone walls. Nestorov, treated with antibiotics and properly warmed, was sleeping peacefully. The rest of the men were engaged in quiet conversation, the tension of their ordeal beginning to ease. We should rest while we can, Sokolov finally said. We'll move at nightfall, following the ridge line back to the outpost. Kuznetsov nodded, rising to his feet. I'll take first watch, sir. No, Sokolov countered. Get some sleep, Sergeant. I think we're safe here. As Kuznetsov moved away to find his own place to rest, Sokolov remained by the window, watching the mountain shadows lengthen across the snow. Somewhere out there, Lieutenant Morozov and his men still patrolled these peaks not as the enemies of the living, but as their guardians. For the first time since arriving at Outpost Vulk, Lieutenant Mikhail Sokolov felt something like peace. The journey back to Outpost Vulk was arduous but uneventful. Moving under cover of darkness, they followed the ridgeline east, then north, guided by stars and Kuznetsov's uncanny sense of direction. Nestorov, though still weak, was able to travel under his own power, the antibiotics and rest having pulled him back from the brink. They approached the outpost cautiously near dawn, alert for any sign that it might have been compromised during their absence. But the perimeter appeared intact, and when they established radio contact, they were answered by Corporal Petrov's relieved voice. We thought you were dead, sir, Petrov admitted as they filed through the gate. When you didn't return after the first day. It was a close thing, Corporal, Sokolov replied. Get these men some hot food and see that Nestorov reports to the medic. As the return patrol dispersed to their various duties, Sokolov headed for the communications alcove. He needed to report to headquarters, though he was still unsure exactly what that report would contain. How did one explain being led to safety by the ghost of a Soviet officer dead for 4 years? The bunker seemed different, somehow smaller, more confining after the vast wilderness they had traversed. Sokolov felt a strange disconnection, as if part of him remained in that shepherd's hut, or perhaps in the cave with the frozen remains of Morozov's men. He was reaching for the radio handset when he noticed something amiss. The communications equipment had been disturbed, dials adjusted, logbooks moved, and there was a faint smell in the air, unfamiliar tobacco, not the cheap Soviet cigarettes his men smoked. Petrov, he called sharply. When was the last radio transmission from headquarters? The corporal appeared in the doorway, his expression puzzled. 3 days ago, sir. Just a routine check-in. And has anyone entered the outpost since we left? Anyone at all? No, sir. We've maintained full security protocols as ordered. Sokolov's unease deepened. He examined the radio more carefully and discovered that the frequency had been changed from their standard channel. Someone had been using their equipment, and recently. Get Kuznetsov, he ordered. And I want every man not on essential duty to assemble in the main room immediately. As Petrov hurried to comply, Sokolov conducted a swift but thorough inspection of the communications alcove. Nothing appeared to be missing, but several items had been moved slightly: the logbook, a code cipher book, even the spare batteries for the field radios. By the time Kuznetsov arrived, Sokolov had formulated a theory that he didn't like at all. Someone's been using our radio, he told the sergeant in a low voice. And they've been through our communications materials. Kuznetsov's expression hardened. Infiltration? Possibly. Or one of our own men. The implications were disturbing. Either someone had managed to penetrate their security without leaving a trace, or one of the soldiers left behind at the outpost was engaged in unauthorized communications, perhaps even espionage. The men assembled quickly, those who had remained at the outpost looking confused and slightly alarmed by the sudden muster. Sokolov studied their faces, searching for signs of guilt or anxiety beyond what might be expected from the unusual summons. While we were away, he began without preamble. Someone used the radio to communicate on an unauthorized frequency. I want to know who and why. The men exchanged glances, but no one spoke. Sokolov hadn't really expected an immediate confession. Until this matter is resolved, all communications will require my direct authorization. Sergeant Kuznetsov will oversee a complete inventory of all equipment and supplies. If anything at all is missing or out of place, I want to know about it. As the men dispersed to their duties, Sokolov pulled Kuznetsov aside. Post additional guards tonight. Double the watch. And keep this quiet, but I want our bunks searched while the men are on duty. The sergeant nodded grimly. You think we have a spy, sir? I don't know what to think yet. But after what we've just been through, I'm not taking any chances. The day passed in a tense hush. The men who had remained at the outpost were clearly unsettled by Sokolov's accusations, while those who had endured the ordeal in the mountains were too exhausted to care much about internal politics. Kuznetsov conducted his inventory with typical thoroughness, reporting back as evening approached. Nothing obviously missing, sir. But there are discrepancies in the ammunition count. 2 magazines for the Alaska 74 unaccounted for. Sokolov frowned. Could be a counting error from the previous inventory. Possible. But there's something else. The lock on the storage compartment under the communications desk has been forced. Subtly but definitely tampered with. That was more concerning. The compartment contained backup communication codes and emergency protocols, nothing of critical strategic value, but certainly sensitive information. What was inside? Sokolov asked. That's just it, sir. I don't know exactly what should have been there. The inventory list is missing too. Before Sokolov could respond, a commotion erupted from the main room of the bunker. Shouts, then the unmistakable sound of a scuffle. Both officers rushed to investigate. They found Private Volkov pinned against the wall by Corporal Petrov, the younger man's face bloody from what appeared to be a solid punch. What the hell is going on here? Sokolov demanded. Found him going through my footlocker, sir. Petrov snarled, maintaining his grip on Volkov's collar. Caught him red-handed. I wasn't stealing anything, Volkov protested. I was looking for my spare field dressings. I thought maybe Petrov had borrowed them. Bullshit, Petrov spat. You were rifling through my personal papers. Enough. Sokolov's voice cut through the tension. Release him, Corporal. Now. Petrov complied reluctantly, stepping back with his fists still clenched. Both of you, my quarters. Immediately. Sokolov turned to Kuznetsov. Continue the inventory, Sergeant. I want every corner of this outpost examined. In the relative privacy of the small alcove that served as the lieutenant's quarters, Sokolov confronted the 2 men. One of you is lying, and I want to know which one. Volkov, explain yourself. The young private wiped blood from his split lip. I was looking for my medical supplies, sir. Honestly. After what happened in the mountains, I make house I wanted to be better prepared. I thought maybe Petrov had borrowed them, he's done it before. So you decided to go through his personal belongings without permission? Volkov looked down, properly chastened. It was wrong, sir. I should have asked. Sokolov turned to Petrov. And you, Corporal, why the excessive response to a relatively minor infraction? Petrov's jaw tightened. No one touches my things, sir. Especially not my personal correspondence. There was something in Petrov's tone, a defensiveness that went beyond normal privacy concerns. Sokolov made a mental note to have Kuznetsov check the corporal's belongings more thoroughly during the search. Volkov, you're confined to quarters for the remainder of the day. Petrov, you'll take his watch duty in addition to your own. Dismissed. After they left, Sokolov remained in his quarters, mulling over the incident. It could have been exactly what it appeared, a misunderstanding escalated by the tension of their situation. but it could also have been something else entirely. Volkov searching for evidence, perhaps, or Petrov overreacting because he had something to hide. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Baranov, his expression troubled. "Sir, I think you should see this." He led Sokolov to the bunks, where Kuznetsov had apparently continued his search in their absence. The sergeant was examining something he'd found beneath the thin mattress of one of the beds. "Whose bunk?" Sokolov asked as he approached. "Kovalev's," Kuznetsov replied, handing over what he'd discovered. It was a folded piece of paper, worn at the creases from repeated handling. Sokolov opened it carefully, revealing a hand-drawn map of the surrounding mountain. Several locations were marked with small X's, including their outpost and what appeared to be the cave system they had recently escaped from. But what drew Sokolov's attention was a location marked with a circle, rather than an X, a spot deep in the mountains, to the northwest, labeled with a series of numbers that could be coordinates. "Have you asked Kovalev about this?" Sokolov inquired, studying the map. "He's on perimeter duty," Kuznetsov said. "Due back in an hour." "Let's keep this between us for now," Sokolov decided, pocketing the map. "When he returns, bring him to my quarters directly. No mention of what we found." Baranov and Kuznetsov nodded their understanding. As they continued their search, Sokolov returned to the communications alcove, determined to learn what the mysterious coordinates on Kovalev's map might indicate. He spread out the official military maps of the region, locating the approximate position marked on the hand-drawn version. It was in a particularly remote area, far from any known settlements or military installations, a deep valley surrounded by some of the tallest peaks in the Hindu Kush. Consulting a different map that showed geological features, Sokolov noticed something interesting. The valley contained a small lake, unusual at that altitude. And according to the topographical markings, the surrounding terrain was unusually flat for a mountain region, almost like a landing strip. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Someone could land a small aircraft there, a helicopter certainly, perhaps even a fixed-wing craft with adequate skill. It would be completely hidden from aerial surveillance by the surrounding peaks, invisible to satellite reconnaissance most of the year due to cloud cover. Perfect for clandestine operations. Perfect for something that needed to remain hidden from both Soviet and Afghan government forces. But what? Sokolov was still pondering this question when Kuznetsov appeared at the entrance to the alcove. "Sir, we've completed the search of personal belongings. And nothing suspicious in most cases. Normal letters from home, photographs, personal items." The sergeant paused. "But we found something odd in Petrov's locker. A notebook with what appears to be coded messages. And this." He handed Sokolov a small metal object, a pin in the shape of an eagle, its wings spread in a familiar design that was definitely not Soviet. "American," Sokolov said quietly, examining the pin. It was the kind of insignia that might be worn by U.S. military personnel in civilian clothing, subtle enough to be overlooked by most, but recognizable to those who knew what to look for. "There's more," Kuznetsov continued. "The ammunition that's missing. It's the right caliber for an American M16, not our AKs." The pieces were beginning to fit together, forming a picture that made Sokolov's blood run cold. Petrov's defensiveness about his personal papers, the unauthorized radio transmissions, the map in Kovalev's bunk with coordinates for what might be a clandestine landing site. "Where is Petrov now?" he asked, his voice tight. "Still on watch duty, sir. Eastern perimeter." "And Kovalev?" "Due back any minute. I've instructed Baranov to bring him directly to you." Sokolov nodded, his mind racing through the implications. "We need to secure Petrov without alerting him that we suspect anything. If he is working with the Americans, there could be others involved. We can't risk tipping our hand." "Agreed," Kuznetsov said. "I'll relieve him personally, bring him in for questioning." Before Sokolov could respond, shouts erupted from outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of gunfire. Both officers bolted from the communications alcove, weapons drawn. They emerged into chaos. At the eastern perimeter, Petrov was engaged in a firefight with unseen assailants beyond the fence line. Several other soldiers had taken defensive positions, returning fire into the darkness. "Contact front," someone shouted. "Multiple hostiles." Sokolov ran to the nearest defensive position, dropping behind a sandbag wall next to Private Morozov. "Report," he demanded, peering through the gloom to identify targets. "Mujahideen, sir," Morozov replied, squeezing off a careful shot. "At least a dozen, maybe more. They hit the eastern perimeter first, but now they're circling around." Sokolov's mind raced. This was no random attack. The timing was too perfect, coming just as they discovered evidence of potential espionage. Either they were facing an extraordinary coincidence, or... "Where's Kovalov?" he asked sharply. Morozov looked confused. "Should be at the northern perimeter, sir." That was his assigned post. But when Sokolov scanned the defensive positions, he couldn't see Kovalev anywhere. The implications were disturbing. If both Petrov and Kovalev were involved in something clandestine, this attack could be a diversion, or worse, a coordinated effort to eliminate witnesses. "Kuznetsov," he called to the sergeant, who was directing fire from a nearby position. "Find Kovalev. Check the communications room." As Kuznetsov disappeared back into the bunker, Sokolov focused on the immediate threat. The Mujahideen were employing classic guerrilla tactics: strike quickly, create confusion, avoid direct engagement. But something about their approach seemed odd. They weren't pressing their advantage as they normally would, instead maintaining distance and suppressive fire. Almost as if they were waiting for something. The answer came moments later when Kuznetsov's voice crackled over the radio. "Lieutenant, Kovalov is in the communications room. He's destroyed the equipment, and so the hidden compartment under the desk has been completely emptied." So that was it. Not a full-scale attack, but a raid, a mission to extract Kovalev and whatever he had retrieved from the hidden compartment. The Mujahideen were likely working with American advisors, or perhaps directly with the CIA, using the chaos of the Afghan conflict as cover for intelligence operations. "Detain him," Sokolov ordered into his radio. "Use whatever force necessary." But it was already too late. An explosion rocked the northern side of the perimeter, a breach in their defenses. Through the gap, Sokolov glimpsed figures moving with the disciplined precision that marked professional soldiers, not guerrilla fighters. And in their midst, running toward the mountain darkness beyond, was Private Kovalev, clutching what appeared to be a document case. "Traitor," Sokolov snarled, raising his rifle. But the shot was impossible. Too many figures moving, too great a distance, too poor the light. As suddenly as it had begun, the attack tapered off. The Mujahideen and their mysterious allies melted back into the night, taking with them whatever secrets had been hidden in the compartment beneath the communications desk. And leaving behind a shattered outpost, 2 dead Soviet soldiers, and the bitter taste of betrayal. The aftermath of the attack was a somber affair. 2 men dead, Private Zaitsev and Baranov, both shot while defending the northern perimeter. 3 others wounded, though none critically. The communications equipment destroyed beyond immediate repair, isolating them further. And Petrov had disappeared during the confusion, confirming Sokolov's suspicion that both he and Kovalev had been working against Soviet interests. Whether they were American agents, Afghan sympathizers, or simply soldiers who had been turned by promises of money and freedom, the result was the same: Outpost Vulk had been compromised from within. As the men tended to the wounded and reinforced their damaged defenses, Sokolov retreated to the communications alcove, surveying the destruction with a mixture of anger and professional assessment. The radio had been methodically disabled, key components removed or destroyed. It would take specialized equipment and expertise to restore functionality, resources they simply didn't have. Kuznetsov joined him, his weathered face grim in the lantern light. "We've secured the perimeter as best we can, sir. Set up additional observation points to prevent another surprise attack." "Good work," Sokolov acknowledged. "What about the hidden compartment? Any idea what was taken?" The sergeant shook his head. "Without an inventory, it's impossible to know exactly. But given the effort expended to retrieve it, it must have been valuable intelligence." Sokolov nodded, his mind returning to the journal he had recovered from the cave, Lieutenant Morozov's final testament. There had been a mention of a mission, something beyond a simple patrol. What if the lost squad from 1979 had been sent to secure sensitive information or technology? What if that mission had never been completed? "Sergeant," he said suddenly, "what do you know about American operations in this region during the early days of the war?" Kuznetsov considered the question. "Not much, sir. They weren't openly involved then. That came later, with the increased arms shipments to the Mujahideen. But there were rumors." "What kind of rumors?" "Intelligence gathering, high-altitude reconnaissance flights. Some said an American aircraft went down in these mountains in late '79, shot down or mechanical failure. No one knew for sure. The story was that both sides were racing to recover sensitive equipment or intelligence from the wreckage. The timing aligned perfectly with the disappearance of Morozov's squad. Sokolov felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. "I think I know what Kovalev took," he said quietly. "Information about that crash site. The original mission parameters for Morozov's squad. Maybe even coordinates." "But why now?" Kuznetsov asked. "After all these years?" "Because of us," Sokolov realized. "Because we found the bodies. Because we've been seeing Morozov's ghost. Someone at headquarters must have reported our sightings, triggering interest in the old mission. Kovalev and Petrov were probably instructed to search for any information related to it." It made a terrible kind of sense. The ghost had been trying to lead them to something, not just to safety, but to the completion of a mission left unfinished 4 years earlier. "If you're right," Kuznetsov said slowly, "then Kovalev and his American friends will be heading for the crash site, using the information they stole to finally recover whatever was so important." Sokolov nodded, his decision already made. "Then we need to get there first." "Sir?" Kuznetsov looked startled. "With all due respect, we're in no condition to pursue. 2 men dead, 3 wounded, no communications, limited supplies." "I'm aware of our situation, Sergeant," Sokolov cut him off. "But consider the alternatives. We can sit here and wait for a relief force that may not come for weeks, or we can act on what we know. If American agents are operating in our territory, recovering sensitive Soviet intelligence or technology, it's our duty to stop them." Kuznetsov didn't look convinced, but he nodded reluctantly. "How would we even find this crash site? We don't have the coordinates Kovalev stole." Sokolov pulled out the hand-drawn map they'd found in Kovalev's bunk. "We have this, and we have these." He produced the journal recovered from Morozov's remains. "There might be clues here that can lead us to the site." For the next hour, they pored over the journal and maps, searching for any indication of where the American aircraft might have crashed. Most of Morozov's entries were too damaged to read, but occasionally a phrase or reference provided a tantalizing hint. "Here," Sokolov said, pointing to a partially legible passage. "He mentions a metal bird and strange instruments in what I think is the December 19th entry, and later something about a ravine like a scar that might be a crash site description." They compared these fragments with the military maps of the region, looking for terrain features that matched. The task was made more difficult by the vague nature of the references in the vast, complex mountain landscape they were trying to navigate. "This could be it," Kuznetsov finally suggested, indicating a narrow ravine about 15 kilometers northwest of their position. "It matches the general direction Morozov describes, and the topography would make it nearly invisible from the air, perfect for a crash site that both sides wanted to keep secret." Sokolov studied the location. It wasn't far from the coordinates marked on Kovalev's map, close enough that it could be the same site, allowing for the imprecision of hand-drawn cartography. "That's our target," he decided. "We'll move at first light. Small team, fast and light, just our most capable men. The wounded and a minimal security detail will remain here." "Who do you want for the mission team?" Kuznetsov asked. Sokolov considered their remaining manpower. "You, Orlov, for his marksmanship, Morozov for his analytical skills, and Volkov, he's young but he's proven himself in the mountains. 5 of us against unknown opposition," Kuznetsov summarized. "Not ideal odds." "When are they ever in this war?" Sokolov replied with a grim smile. "Brief the men. Minimum equipment, maximum ammunition. We move out at dawn." As Kuznetsov departed to prepare the selected soldiers, Sokolov remained with the maps and journal, searching for any additional clues he might have missed. The mission was a gamble, perhaps even a foolish one given their circumstances. But something drove him forward, a certainty that went beyond military duty or patriotism. Lieutenant Morozov and his men had died trying to complete their mission. Their spirits remained, unable to rest, guiding those who followed. Sokolov owed it to them, to Morozov especially, to finish what they had started. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the damaged outpost like a living thing. Sokolov paused in his planning, listening to its mournful cry. For a moment he could almost imagine it carried voices, the whispers of men long dead but not departed, soldiers whose he transcended even death itself. "We're coming," he murmured to the empty room, to the ghost he could not see but somehow felt watching over him. "We'll finish your mission, Lieutenant Morozov. You have my word." The wind seemed to ease as if in acknowledgement. In the silence that followed, Sokolov returned to his preparations, now more determined than ever to uncover the cold truth waiting in the mountains ahead. The wind rose to a howling crescendo as Sokolov led his men into position. They had spent the last hour crawling through snowdrifts, using the terrain to conceal their approach to the Mujahideen camp. From their vantage point on a small rise, they could see the enemy fighters, at least 20 of them, gathered around several fires, apparently unconcerned about being discovered in this remote section of the mountains. "Too many," Kuznetsov whispered, his breath forming a small cloud in the frigid air. "We should fall back, find another route." Sokolov shook his head. "No time. Kovalev and whoever he's working with could reach the crash site by tomorrow. We need to push through." He studied the enemy position through his binoculars. The Mujahideen were well-armed Soviet Alaska 47s captured from previous engagements, alongside American-supplied weapons. Several fighters wore the distinctive Pakel hats and traditional vests laden with ammunition pouches. "There," Sokolov said, pointing to a narrow gap between two rocky outcroppings on the camp's eastern edge. "That's our path. If we time it right, we can slip past during their prayer time." Orlov checked his watch. 20 minutes, sir." They waited in tense silence as the temperature continued to drop. Private Nestorov, still weak from his earlier ordeal but insistent on joining the mission, shivered uncontrollably despite his layers of clothing. Sokolov noticed but said nothing. They all understood the risks. When the call to prayer finally echoed across the valley, the Mujahideen fighters set aside their weapons and knelt facing Mecca. Sokolov gave the signal and his small squad began moving, not directly past the camp, which would be suicide, but along a parallel route that kept them hidden behind a ridge of snow-covered rocks. They had almost cleared the danger zone when disaster struck. Nestorov, struggling to maintain his footing on the icy slope, dislodged a small cascade of rocks that clattered down the hillside. The sound, magnified by the mountain acoustics, carried clearly to the Mujahideen camp. Shouts of alarm erupted immediately. The fighters scrambled for their weapons, prayer forgotten in the face of potential danger. "Run," Sokolov ordered, abandoning stealth for speed. They sprinted through the snow, boots breaking through the crust and sinking ankle-deep with each desperate stride. Behind them, the Mujahideen fanned out in pursuit, their voices carrying on the wind. The first shots rang out as Sokolov's men reached a small copse of stunted pines. Bullets thudded into tree trunks and kicked up snow fountains around them. "Return fire," Sokolov commanded, dropping to one knee and bringing his Alaska 74 to bear. "Orlov, find a position. Pick your targets." The marksman nodded grimly, scrambling up a small rise to gain better visibility. The rest of the squad spread out among the trees, using the minimal cover to best advantage. The firefight erupted in full force. The Mujahideen had numbers, but Sokolov's men had better position and training. For several minutes they held their ground, their disciplined fire taking a toll on the advancing fighters. "They're trying to flank us on the right," Kuznetsov shouted above the gunfire. Sokolov spotted the movement, 5 fighters using a shallow gully to circle around their position. Morozov, Vulk, shift right. "Don't let them get behind us." The 2 soldiers moved immediately, redirecting their fire to counter the flanking maneuver. For a moment it seemed to work. 2 of the flanking fighters went down, and the others hesitated. Then Nestorov cried out, clutching his shoulder where a bullet had torn through his coat and into flesh. Blood, shockingly bright against the white snow, pulsed between his fingers. "Man down," Sokolov called. "Volkov, get into cover." As Volkov dragged the wounded private behind a fallen log, more mujahideen appeared, reinforcements coming from their main camp. The odds, already poor, were deteriorating rapidly. "We're being overrun," Kuznetsov shouted, ejecting an empty magazine and slamming in a fresh one with practiced efficiency. "We need to fall back." But there was nowhere to fall back to, only open ground behind them, offering no cover from the enemy's fire. They were pinned down, outnumbered, with a wounded man and dwindling ammunition. Sokolov felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. This was how it would end, not completing Morozov's mission, but joining him in death on these indifferent mountains. Then, at the moment when all seemed lost, it happened. A solitary figure appeared on the ridge above the Mujahideen position, a Soviet soldier in a tattered greatcoat, standing tall against the sky. Even at this distance, Sokolov recognized the spectral Lieutenant Morozov. The ghost raised an arm, pointing directly at the enemy fighters below. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, inexplicably, several of the Mujahideen turned and began firing wildly at the ridge, shouting in alarm. "They can see him," Kuznetsov whispered in astonishment. "They can all see him." More ghostly figures materialized along the ridgeline, the entire lost squad, appearing as solid as living men in the strange mountain light. They moved with purpose, spreading out as if executing a flanking maneuver of their own. The effect on the Mujahideen was immediate and dramatic. Some fell to their knees, covering their eyes or making warding gestures. Others fired frantically at the apparitions, their shots passing harmlessly through the ghostly soldiers. A few simply ran, dropping their weapons in panic. "Now," Sokolov shouted, recognizing the opportunity. "Counterattack. Push them back." His men responded instantly, rising from cover and advancing with renewed determination. Their coordinated fire caught the disorganized Mujahideen in a deadly crossfire. Within minutes, the tide had turned completely. The enemy fighters were in full retreat, some still firing blindly at phantoms only they could see. As Sokolov led the pursuit, driving the enemy back from their position, he caught glimpses of the ghostly soldiers moving among the Mujahideen, causing confusion and terror wherever they appeared. It was as if two battles were being fought simultaneously, one with bullets and blood, the other with fear and the supernatural. The Mujahideen broke completely, abandoning their camp and fleeing into the mountains. Sokolov called a halt to the pursuit, wary of being drawn into an ambush despite their unexpected advantage. As his men secured the abandoned camp, Sokolov looked up to the ridge where he had first seen Morozov's ghost. The spectral figures were still there, watching. Lieutenant Morozov raised his hand in what might have been a salute, then slowly faded from view, his squad dissolving into the mountain air around him. "Did you see that?" Volkov asked, his young face pale with wonder. "They fought with us. The dead fought with us." "Not dead," Kuznetsov corrected quietly, "just waiting, fulfilling their duty." Sokolov nodded, understanding flowing through him like a current. These weren't malevolent spirits or hallucinations, they were guardians, soldiers who had found a way to continue their mission even after death. As they tended to Nestorov's wound, serious but not life-threatening, and collected valuable supplies from the abandoned Mujahideen camp, Sokolov felt a strange peace amid the chaos of the day. They had survived against impossible odds, and now the path to the crash site lay open before them. Lieutenant Morozov and his ghostly squad had saved them, but Sokolov understood with bone-deep certainty that the mission was not yet complete. The final reckoning still waited for them in the mountains ahead, a cold truth buried in snow and secrets that had waited 4 long years to be revealed. With blood staining the pristine snow and the cries of the retreating enemy echoing across the peaks, Sokolov prepared his men to continue their journey. The guardians of the Hindu Kush had bought them this chance, and he would not waste it. The night settled over the mountains like a shroud as Sokolov's men made camp in the lee of a massive boulder, sheltered from the worst of the wind. They had pushed on for several hours after the firefight, wanting to put distance between themselves and any Mujahideen who might regroup and seek revenge. Private Nestorov lay wrapped in every available blanket, his wounded shoulder bandaged with supplies taken from the enemy camp. The antibiotics they'd found would help ward off infection, but the young soldier's face remained alarmingly pale, his breath shallow. "How is he?" Sokolov asked Morozov, who had the most medical training among them. Stable for now, Morozov replied, checking Nestorov's pulse. The bullet passed clean through, missed the artery, but he's lost blood, and this cold isn't helping. He needs proper medical attention soon. Sokolov nodded grimly. Another difficult decision to make: push forward with their mission or turn back for Nestorov's sake. The lives of his men weighed against the importance of what they sought. As if reading his thoughts, Nestorov spoke up, his voice weak but determined. "Don't turn back for me, Lieutenant. I can keep going." "Save your strength," Sokolov told him, squeezing his good shoulder gently. "We'll decide in the morning." He moved away to join Kuznetsov, who was studying the maps by the light of a carefully shielded flashlight. The sergeant looked up as Sokolov approached. "If we push hard, we can reach the ravine by midday tomorrow," he reported, "assuming the weather holds and we don't encounter more resistance." "And Nestorov?" Kuznetsov's weathered face showed the conflict Sokolov himself felt. "He's tough, but he's weakening. The cold, the blood loss, it's taking a toll. We could leave him with supplies, come back for him after we secure the crash site," Sokolov suggested, though he disliked the idea of splitting their already small force. "In these mountains? Alone?" Kuznetsov shook his head. "The cold would take him, or predators, or he might be found by the enemy." They fell silent, the weight of command pressing down on Sokolov like a physical burden. Every option seemed to lead to potential disaster. "Get some rest," he finally told Kuznetsov. "I'll take first watch." As the sergeant moved to find what comfort he could in their makeshift camp, Sokolov positioned himself at the edge of their shelter, rifle across his knees, eyes scanning the darkness beyond. The stars overhead were brilliant in the clear mountain air, cold and distant as the eyes of indifferent gods. He must have dozed despite his best intentions, for suddenly he became aware of a presence nearby. Opening his eyes, he found himself looking at the ghostly figure of Lieutenant Morozov, standing just beyond the camp's perimeter. Unlike previous appearances, where the ghost had seemed distant or purpose-driven, this time Morozov's spectral form approached deliberately, moving to sit on a rock opposite Sokolov as naturally as if he were a living man joining a comrade on watch. For a long moment, neither spoke, the living lieutenant and the dead one, separated by years yet connected by duty and circumstance. Then, to Sokolov's amazement, Morozov's ghost spoke, his voice carrying on the wind, yet somehow intimate, as if the words formed directly in Sokolov's mind. "Your man is dying," the ghost said simply. Sokolov nodded, beyond surprise at this point. "Yes, we're doing what we can for him. The mission must be completed." It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. "I know," Sokolov replied, "but I can't sacrifice my men needlessly. Surely you understand that." A sad smile crossed the spectral face. "Better than most." Morozov gestured toward the sleeping forms of Sokolov's squad. "I led 8 men into these mountains. None returned." "Why?" Sokolov asked, seizing the opportunity to finally understand. What was so important about this mission? What were you sent to find? The ghost seemed to consider the question, its form flickering slightly like a candle in a draft. An American aircraft crashed in the ravine ahead, highly classified. It carried sensitive equipment, surveillance technology far beyond what we possessed at the time. We were sent to recover it before the Americans could reach the site. "Did you find it?" "We found the crash site, yes. The pilot was dead. The equipment damaged but salvageable." Morozov's ghostly features hardened. Then the storm came. "The worst in decades," they said later. "We took shelter in the caves with what we could carry, planning to continue once the weather cleared. But it didn't clear." Sokolov guessed. "Not for weeks. By then, 5 of my men were already dead from cold and hunger. The rest of us tried to make our way back with the intelligence we'd gathered. Ivanov died on the journey. Then Komarov. I made it to the shepherd's hut alone, but my strength was gone. I hid what we had recovered, hoping someone would find it someday." "The footlocker," Sokolov realized. "The supplies we found. You left them." Morozov's ghost shook its head. "Not I. Others came later. Used the hut as a waypoint, just as we had intended to. Left supplies for those who might follow." A pause. "But what we recovered from the crash site remains hidden, waiting." And that's what Kovalev is seeking, what the Americans want to recover after all these years. Yes, the technology is still valuable even now. And there were other things, documents, plans, things that would be dangerous in the wrong hands. Sokolov leaned forward, intrigued despite the surreal nature of the conversation. Where did you hide it? But Morozov was already fading, his form becoming translucent as the mountain wind seemed to pass through him. Follow the ravine to its end. Look for the stone that stands alone. Beneath it, you will find what we died protecting. Wait, Sokolov called. There's more I need to know. The ghost paused, solidifying briefly. Your man will not die, it said with strange certainty. We will watch over him, as we have watched over all who serve in these mountains. Leave him in the shepherd's hut. He will be safe until your return. The hut is ours back the way we came, Sokolov protested. There is another, smaller. Hidden in the valley ahead, you will find it before dawn. With those words, Lieutenant Morozov's ghost dissolved completely, leaving Sokolov alone with the wind and stars and the weight of a mission that had spanned 4 years and reached beyond death itself. He sat motionless for several minutes, absorbing what he had learned. Then, decision made, he woke Kuznetsov and related the strange conversation. The sergeant listened without interruption, his weathered face impassive. When Sokolov finished, Kuznetsov simply nodded, as if receiving a routine patrol report. You believe him? Sokolov asked, curious about the veteran's reaction. After what we've seen, Kuznetsov shrugged. Besides, it makes sense. The Americans had surveillance aircraft operating along the Soviet border throughout the Cold War. If one went down with classified technology on board, both sides would scramble to recover it. And now, years later, someone has learned what happened to Morozov's squad and wants to find what they hid, Sokolov concluded. The question is, do we trust a ghost's directions? Kuznetsov asked. Sokolov looked out into the darkness where Morozov had stood. He's led us true so far, and we don't have many options. They broke camp before dawn, carrying Nestorov on a makeshift stretcher as they moved through the valley. True to the ghost's word, they found the second shepherd's hut just as the first light of day touched the eastern peaks, a small stone structure nestled against a cliff face, nearly invisible until they were almost upon it. The interior was dusty but sound, with a small hearth and enough space for a wounded man to rest comfortably. They settled Nestorov inside, leaving him with water, rations, medical supplies, and a loaded pistol. We'll return as quickly as possible, Sokolov promised him. Conserve your strength and stay warm. Nestorov nodded weakly. Complete the mission, sir. Don't worry about me. As they prepared to depart, Sokolov pulled Vulk aside. I'm leaving you with Nestorov, he told the young private. Keep him alive. If his condition worsens or if any threat appears, fire 3 shots in rapid succession. We'll come running. Volkov looked disappointed at being left behind but nodded his understanding. Yes, sir. I'll protect him with my life. The remaining 3, Sokolov, Kuznetsov, and Orlov, continued toward the ravine, moving faster now without the burden of carrying Nestorov. The day was clear and cold, the sun glinting off the snow with blinding brilliance. By mid-morning, they reached the entrance to the ravine Morozov had described. It was a jagged cut in the mountainside, as if some ancient giant had taken a massive axe to the stone. The walls rose sheer on either side, casting the bottom into permanent shadow. A narrow game trail wound along the ravine floor, partially obscured by snowdrifts. Looks like a natural funnel, Orlov observed. Perfect place for an ambush. Stay alert, Sokolov ordered. If Kovalev and his American friends are ahead of us, they'll have the same thought. They proceeded cautiously, weapons ready, eyes scanning the cliffs above for any sign of movement. The ravine twisted and turned, sometimes narrowing until they had to proceed single file, other times widening into small basins where the sun managed to penetrate to the floor. In one such basin, they found the first evidence of the crash, a piece of twisted metal half buried in the rocky soil, its surface scorched and weathered, but still recognizably part of an aircraft fuselage. American, Kuznetsov confirmed, examining the fragment. Looks like part of a reconnaissance plane, maybe an SR-71 or something similar. They continued forward, finding more debris scattered along their path, smaller pieces mostly. Nothing that would identify the specific aircraft or its mission. The wreckage had been thoroughly picked over, first by Morozov's squad and later, perhaps, by others who had stumbled upon the site. As the ravine began to widen into what appeared to be its terminus, Sokolov raised his hand, signaling a halt. Ahead, the walls of the ravine curved outward to form a rough amphitheater of stone. In the center of this natural arena stood a single, upright stone, exactly as Morozov had described. But they weren't alone. 3 figures were already there, gathered around the stone. 2 were clearly Mujahideen fighters, armed with Alaska 47s. The third, directing their efforts as they dug at the base of the standing stone, was unmistakably Kovalev. "Down," Sokolov whispered, and the 3 Russians dropped to their bellies in the snow, crawling forward to a position behind a fallen boulder that offered both concealment and a clear line of sight to the stone. Through his binoculars, Sokolov could see that Kovalev was speaking urgently, gesturing at the ground where the Mujahideen were digging. He wore civilian clothes, now Western in style, and carried what appeared to be an American-made sidearm. "Definite traitor," Kuznetsov growled. "Working with the enemy." "3 of them, 3 of us," Orlov noted, adjusting his rifle's sighting. "I can take Kovalev from here. Say the word." Sokolov considered their options. A direct assault would be risky. They had no cover for the approach, and the enemy was well armed. But they couldn't allow Kovalev to recover whatever Morozov had hidden. "Wait," he decided. "Let them do the hard work of digging. Once they find what they're looking for, we'll make our move." For nearly 20 minutes, they watched as the Mujahideen fighters excavated around the base of the standing stone. Finally, one of them gave a shout of triumph, pulling something from the earth, a metal case, roughly the size of a small briefcase, covered in dirt, but clearly military in design. Kovalev grabbed it eagerly, brushing away soil to examine what appeared to be a locking mechanism. As he worked to open it, Sokolov gave the signal. "Now, Orlov, take Kovalev, Kuznetsov, the fighter on the left. I'll handle the one on the right. On my mark, fire." 3 shots rang out almost simultaneously, echoing off the ravine walls. 2 of the Mujahideen fighters dropped immediately. But Kovalev, whether through instinct or luck, moved at the last second. Orlov's bullet grazed his shoulder instead of striking center mass. Wounded but still functional, Kovalev grabbed the metal case and sprinted for cover behind a pile of rocks, firing wildly in their direction with his pistol. "Damn it," Orlov swore. "Sorry, sir." "Move up," Sokolov ordered. "Don't let him escape with that case." They advanced quickly, using the terrain for cover as they closed the distance to Kovalev's position. Bullets whined off rocks around them as the traitor continued to fire, his shots growing more accurate as he recovered from the initial shock. "Surrender, Kovalev," Sokolov shouted. "There's nowhere to run." "Go to hell," came the reply, followed by another volley of gunfire. The firefight continued for several minutes, a deadly game of cat and mouse among the rocks and snow. Kovalev was pinned down but refusing to surrender, while Sokolov and his men couldn't approach without exposing themselves to his fire. Then, unexpectedly, Kovalev made a break for it, abandoning his protected position to sprint toward a narrow fissure in the ravine wall that might offer escape. Orlov fired, missing narrowly. Kuznetsov's shot hit Kovalev in the leg, sending him tumbling to the ground. The metal case flew from his grasp, sliding across the snow to rest against a rock. Sokolov emerged from cover, weapon trained on the fallen traitor. "It's over, Kovalev. Don't make me kill you." Blood soaking through his pant leg, Kovalev glared up with a mixture of pain and defiance. "You don't understand what you're involved in, Lieutenant. This is bigger than you, bigger than all of us." "Enlighten me," Sokolov said, keeping his rifle steady. Kovalev laughed bitterly. "You think this is about some old American surveillance tech? That's just a cover story. What's in that case could change the balance of power in this region for decades to come." "What are you talking about?" But Kovalev never got the chance to explain. A shot rang out from somewhere high on the ravine wall, a sniper's shot, precise and deadly. Kovalev's head snapped back, a red mist exploding into the air as he collapsed lifelessly to the snow. "Sniper," Kuznetsov shouted. "Take cover." They dove behind rocks as more shots peppered their position. Sokolov risked a quick glance upward and spotted movement on the ridgeline, at least 2 figures, maybe more, working their way down toward the ravine floor. Americans, he guessed. Kovalov's real partners. "What about the case?" Orlov asked. It lay exposed in the open halfway between their position and Kovalov's body. Sokolov made a split-second decision. "Cover me." Before the others could protest, he burst from cover, running in a zigzag pattern toward the metal case. Bullets kicked up snow around him as he ran, the sniper tracking his movement. He dove the last few meters, sliding across the snow to snatch the case just as a bullet struck the ground where it had rested. Rolling behind a boulder, Sokolov clutched the case to his chest, breathing heavily. Kuznetsov and Orlov provided covering fire, forcing the sniper to duck back from the ridgeline. "We need to move," Sokolov called to his men. "Back down the ravine." They began a fighting retreat, leapfrogging from cover to cover as they made their way back the way they had come. The American operatives, for that's surely what they were, pursued cautiously, unwilling to expose themselves to the Russians' fire, but equally determined not to let them escape with the case. Just as they reached the narrowest part of the ravine, where the walls pinched together to form a natural choke point, Sokolov felt a familiar change in the air, a sudden drop in temperature, a pressure in his ears as if descending rapidly in an aircraft. Then, like an answered prayer, the ghostly figures appeared. Lieutenant Morozov and his squad, standing in the ravine ahead of them, facing toward their pursuers. "They're here," Sokolov told his men, though he wasn't sure if they could see the apparitions. "I see them," Kuznetsov confirmed softly. "All of them." The ghosts moved forward, passing through the living Russians, as if they were no more substantial than smoke. As they approached the American operatives, a strange thing happened. The pursuers faltered, then stopped completely. Through his binoculars, Sokolov could see their expressions of shock and disbelief. They can see them too, he realized, just like the Mujahideen could. Protected by their supernatural rear guard, Sokolov and his men made their escape, running down the ravine and back toward the shepherd's hut, where they had left Nestorov and Volkov. Behind them, they could hear scattered shots, the Americans firing uselessly at targets that could not be harmed by earthly weapons. By the time they reached the hut, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the snow. They found Nestorov improved his color better, his eyes more alert, and Volkov standing watch with nervous vigilance. "Any trouble?" Sokolov asked as they entered. "No, sir," Volkov reported. "It's been quiet." But he hesitated. "I saw them, sir." The ghosts. They were standing outside like they were standing guard. "I thought I was hallucinating at first, but Nestorov saw them too." "They've been protecting us all along," Sokolov said, setting down the metal case. "And now we have what they died for." They gathered around as Sokolov examined the case. It was Soviet-made, military-grade, designed to withstand extreme conditions. The locking mechanism was sophisticated but not impossible for someone with the right knowledge. "Can you open it?" Kuznetsov asked. Sokolov nodded. "I think so. It's similar to the secure cases we used in intelligence training." Working carefully, he manipulated the lock, feeling for the subtle clicks that would indicate the tumblers aligning. After several tense minutes, the lock disengaged with a solid thunk, and the case lid loosened. They leaned forward as Sokolov lifted the lid, revealing the contents that had cost so many lives over so many years. Inside, nestled in protective foam, was a small device unlike anything Sokolov had seen before, a metallic cylinder with intricate circuitry visible through a glass panel on one side. Beside it lay a leather-bound notebook and several microfilm canisters. "What is it?" Volkov asked, peering at the strange device. Sokolov carefully lifted the notebook, opening it to find pages of technical diagrams and dense Cyrillic text. As he skimmed the contents, his blood ran cold. "It's not American technology," he said quietly. "It's ours. Soviet." "What?" Kuznetsov looked confused. "Then why would an American plane be carrying it?" "Because they stole it," Sokolov explained, continuing to read. "This is the prototype for a new kind of targeting system, one that could guide missiles with unprecedented accuracy, even through heavy electronic countermeasures. It was developed at a secret facility near Semipalatinsk, then stolen by an American agent. The plane was escaping with it, Orlov realized, until it crashed here. Exactly. And Morozov's squad was sent to recover both the technology and evidence of the security breach. Sokolov turned to the last pages of the notebook where handwritten notes had been added. Morozov documented everything here: the crash site, the recovery of the prototype, and his identification of the American agent who stole it. Who was it? Kuznetsov asked. Sokolov's expression hardened as he read the final entry. A Soviet officer, a colonel in the CRU named Baranov. Baranov? Volkov repeated in shock. Like our Baranov? The one who died in the attack on the outpost. No relation, I'm sure, Sokolov said. But it explains why this mission was reactivated after all these years. Someone discovered the connection between our reports of ghostly soldiers and Morozov's lost squad. They realized the technology and evidence might still be recoverable. And they sent Kovalov and Petrov to find it, Kuznetsov concluded. But who were they really working for? The Americans? I don't think so, Sokolov said, closing the notebook carefully. Kovalev said this was bigger than all of us. I think they were working for someone within our own ranks, someone connected to the original theft, someone who wanted to ensure this evidence never came to light. The implications were staggering: a conspiracy reaching back years, involving high-level Soviet military intelligence, with tentacles that extended into the present day. If Sokolov was right, they had stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple recovery mission. What do we do now? Orlov asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. Sokolov carefully replaced the items in the case and secured it. We complete our mission. We return to the outpost with Nestorov, then make our way back to headquarters with this evidence. What happens after that? He shrugged. That will be up to higher authorities than us. As night fell fully outside the shepherd's hut, they took turns standing watch, the precious case never far from Sokolov's side. During his shift near midnight, he stepped outside briefly to survey their surroundings. The night was clear and cold, stars burning with fierce brilliance in the black sky. And there, standing in silent formation at the perimeter of their temporary sanctuary, were the ghostly soldiers, Lieutenant Morozov and his squad, maintaining their eternal vigil. Sokolov approached Morozov's ghost, stopping a few paces away. We found it, he said simply. We know the truth now. The spectral figure nodded, satisfaction evident even in its ethereal features. Is it over? Sokolov asked. Can you rest now? Morozov's ghost seemed to consider this, then slowly shook its head. The meaning was clear: their duty continued, their watch unending. They had chosen to remain as guardians of the Hindu Kush, protecting those who followed in their footsteps. Sokolov raised his hand in a formal salute, honoring the sacrifice and dedication of men who had transcended death itself in service to their duty. After a moment, Lieutenant Morozov returned the salute with solemn dignity. No words were spoken, none were needed. As Sokolov lowered his hand, the ghostly figures began to fade, dissolving into the cold mountain air until nothing remained but swirling snow and starlight. Yet somehow, Sokolov knew they were still there, invisible but present, watching over the mountains they had claimed as their eternal post. The guardians of the Hindu Kush would continue their vigil long after he and his men had gone, silent sentinels standing between the living and the merciless embrace of these ancient peaks. With a sense of profound peace, Sokolov returned to the hut, carrying with him not just the physical evidence they had recovered, but a deeper understanding of duty and sacrifice that would remain with him long after the mountains of Afghanistan had faded from his sight. The journey back to headquarters was long and arduous. Nestorov's condition stabilized enough for travel, though they moved slowly, taking frequent breaks to allow him to rest. The metal case remained securely strapped to Sokolov's back, its weight a constant reminder of the responsibility they carried. 3 days after leaving the shepherd's hut, they reached the main Soviet base at Bagram. Their arrival caused a stir, a patrol long overdue, returning with a wounded man and an air of grim determination that even the most hardened officers noticed. They were immediately separated for debriefing. Sokolov found himself in a Spartan office, facing a colonel from military intelligence who introduced himself simply as Volinov. Quite a story, Lieutenant Volinov said after Sokolov had related their experiences. omitting only the most supernatural elements. Betrayal, espionage, a decades-old conspiracy. It sounds more like fiction than a field report. Nevertheless, it's what happened, sir, Sokolov replied evenly. The evidence is all there in the case. Volinov nodded thoughtfully, tapping his fingers on the metal container that now sat on his desk. Yes, the case. Most interesting. Tell me, Lieutenant, have you discussed its contents with anyone outside your immediate squad? No, sir. As per protocols for classified material. Very good. Very professional. The colonel's smile didn't reach his eyes. I'll need to hold on to this, of course, for proper analysis. Something in Volinov's tone triggered Sokolov's instincts. The colonel was too calm, too accepting of their incredible story, and he hadn't asked a single question about Kovalov or Petrov's betrayal, almost as if he already knew the details. Of course, sir, Sokolov said carefully. I assume you'll want statements from my men as well? They can corroborate my account. Oh, that won't be necessary, Volinov replied, waving a dismissive hand. Your report is quite comprehensive. I see no need to trouble them further. They've been through enough. Warning bells rang louder in Sokolov's mind. Standard procedure would demand cross-examination of all witnesses to such a significant event. Volinov's casual dismissal suggested he had no intention of creating an official record of their discovery. Sir, with respect, this evidence implicates a high-ranking Soviet officer in treason. Surely that warrants thorough investigation. Volinov's expression hardened slightly. Lieutenant, you've done your duty admirably. Now allow me to do mine. This matter requires discretion at the highest levels. I'm sure you understand. I understand that Colonel Baranov betrayed his country, Sokolov pressed, watching Volinov's reaction closely, and that someone has gone to great lengths to cover up that betrayal, even decades later. A flicker of something, anger? Fear? Crossed Volinov's face before his professional mask reasserted itself. Colonel Baranov died a hero's death in 1980, Lieutenant. His record is beyond reproach. Not according to Lieutenant Morozov's notes, Sokolov countered. Morozov. Volinov's eyebrows rose. The officer who disappeared with his squad. Hardly a reliable source, wouldn't you say? A man who failed in his mission and likely fabricated accusations to cover his own incompetence. Sokolov felt a surge of anger at this casual dismissal of Morozov's sacrifice. He didn't fail, sir. He completed his mission under impossible conditions. He and his men gave their lives to protect that evidence. And yet here it is, retrieved by you. Volinov smiled thinly. For which you will be commended, of course. I'm recommending you for the Order of the Red Star. Perhaps even promotion to captain. The bribe was as transparent as it was insulting. Sokolov realized with cold certainty that Volinov was part of the conspiracy, whether connected directly to Baranov or simply tasked with burying evidence that would embarrass the military establishment. Thank you, sir, he said neutrally. But I would prefer to see justice done. Justice? Volinov laughed, a hollow sound. Lieutenant, we are fighting a war. Justice is a luxury for peacetime. Now, you're dismissed. Get some rest. We'll speak again after I've reviewed this material. Sokolov stood, saluted crisply, and left the office. Outside, he found Kuznetsov waiting, his weathered face set in lines of concern. Problems? The sergeant asked quietly as they walked together toward the barracks. Volinov has no intention of investigating, Sokolov confirmed. He's going to bury the evidence, just like someone tried to do by sending Kovalov and Petrov. Are you surprised? Kuznetsov asked. Men like Baranov have friends in high places, friends who protect each other, even beyond the grave. So we just accept it. Let them win. Kuznetsov shrugged. What choice do we have? We're soldiers, not politicians. We follow orders, we fight, we die if necessary. But we don't change the system. They walked in silence for a moment, passing other soldiers who paid them little attention. Finally, Sokolov spoke again. Morozov didn't accept it, he said. He found a way to ensure the truth survived, even after death. And what would you suggest? Kuznetsov asked. That we haunt the halls of the Kremlin until someone listens? Despite the gravity of their situation, Sokolov smiled. No, but there are other ways to preserve the truth. Morozov kept a record, so can we. 3 months later, Lieutenant Mikhail Sokolov stood at attention before the memorial wall at the main Soviet base in Kabul. Newly etched into the stone were the names of Lieutenant Pavel Morozov and his squad, finally acknowledged officially as casualties of the Afghan conflict. It had taken persistent effort and the careful calling in of favors, but Sokolov had managed to ensure that these men, at least, would not be forgotten by history. As for the conspiracy surrounding Colonel Baranov and the stolen technology that remained unresolved, Colonel Volinov had indeed buried the evidence, as Sokolov had predicted. The case and its contents had vanished into the labyrinthine bureaucracy of Soviet military intelligence. But Sokolov had taken precautions of his own. Before surrendering the case, he had photographed every page of Morozov's notebook and the accompanying technical documents. These images, along with his own detailed account of their experiences, now existed in multiple copies, entrusted to individuals both within and outside the military who could be counted on to preserve them. Someday, perhaps, the full truth would emerge. For now, it was enough that he had honored his promise to Morozov to complete the mission and ensure the dead lieutenant's testimony survived. Kuznetsov joined him at the memorial, his uniform crisp despite the oppressive heat of the Kabul summer. They stood in silence for a moment, reading the names etched in stone. "Do you think they know?" Kuznetsov finally asked. "That we added their names here?" "I think they know," Sokolov replied. "I think they've always known more than we realized." As if in confirmation, a cool breeze suddenly swept across the memorial plaza, stirring the dust at their feet strange in the still summer air. Both men felt it simultaneously, that now familiar change in pressure, the sensation of being watched by eyes neither could see. "They're here," Kuznetsov said softly. Sokolov nodded, surveying the empty plaza that somehow didn't feel empty at all. "They've always been here, and they always will be." As they turned to leave, Sokolov cast one final glance back at the memorial. For just a moment, so briefly he might have imagined it, he saw them standing there, Lieutenant Morozov and his squad, at attention before the wall that finally acknowledged their sacrifice. Then they were gone, returned to their eternal patrol in the mountains they had claimed as their own. The guardians of the Hindu Kush, watching over those who followed, ensuring that even in the harshest battlefield on Earth, no Soviet soldier would ever truly stand alone. Sokolov saluted once more, then walked away, carrying with him the knowledge that some soldiers never truly leave their posts, that duty, honor, and brotherhood could transcend even the final boundary between life and death. And in the mountains, through snow and wind and the passage of years, the ghostly soldiers continued their vigil, their forms occasionally glimpsed by patrols in remote valleys, their presence felt in moments of dire need, their legend growing with each whispered story passed between soldiers huddled against the cold. Guardians in death as they had been in life, bound by an oath that not even the grave could break.